We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us.
Hello, I wanted to welcome everyone to this podcast, which is being hosted by the UMD School of Public Policy Alumni Board. This is being created, edited by Evan Papp, who is a former board member, so we just want to shout him out. As part of our efforts this year to celebrate the achievements of the school and to uplift and spotlight things happening in the school public policy community, we wanted to take some time to speak with Dr. Alana Hackshaw. I do want to kind of paint the narrative of what sort of got you interested in higher education, academia, as it were, and sort of what led you to working in higher education.
Thank you for that. Thank you for having me here today. And so I just want to say, I sort of had I think an interesting path to where I am now. I went straight to a doctoral program from my undergraduate degree, and I wanted to study political science, and I thought I wanted to be a research professor. And my interests were really in trying to see and have the discipline that I was in understand and explore race as an important variable in understanding how people are involved in politics. Because when I was in graduate school, it was just not, in my opinion, as well supported as it should be. So for me, the driving factor for a lot of things is how can we talk more? How can we center discussions about race and understanding all aspects of people's lives? In particular for me, it was politics. So as I went through my graduate program and experienced various instances of resistance, including my presence being in a graduate program, that really, it lit a fire because it was an extremely challenging and painful experience, but it also told me that the reason it's not happening is because people are not understanding. They don't understand race, and there are ways in which our society is so separate that we've got to figure out ways to get people more aware, more talking, more connected on this issue. So when I finished my graduate degree, I actually decided not to pursue a tenure track position because I felt that that's not what I wanted to do anymore. And I went into the nonprofit sector and I did research as a senior research analyst. I worked for some nonprofits. And then I took a break. I stayed home and raised 2 boys for about 4 or 5 years. And at that point, I decided I really wanted to come back into academia, but my focus really was on teaching. I wanted to say, okay, I can create classes where I think we can have these conversations, but I've got the background and the training and the literature that I can bring to the classroom. But I was also interested in academe as a structure and trying to understand the spaces where where the people need to be, it needs to be part of the culture. How do we create a culture administratively that facilitates what's happening in the classroom? So when I decided to come back to work, my interest was to come back into teaching and to eventually move into administration. And so I started out in African American Studies and eventually moved to SPP in 2019. And so in saying that, those are 2 very different institutional experiences. And coming into SPP, there was a lot of support and interest among some people, but there was a lot of work to be done. That was one of the things that I first noticed when I came initially as an associate clinical professor. And from there, getting connected with other people in the school, like Dean Harris, our director of undergraduate studies, our chief diversity officer at the time. This is where the conversations where people wanted to push against what I mean, there was resistance. There's different ways in which you can classify resistance. A lot of it was, I think people didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to talk about it, even though people had been here trying to do this for a while. So that sort of lit a fire in me too. Like when you see a gap, you want to do something. And if you do, you have skills and you have the support, and there are also people that have a common interest. I was like, okay, this is a good space for me to be in. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Like just for our audience, I have been either a student at the school or doing alumni board things at the school in a general sense since 2010. I got my bachelor's and my master's at Maryland. And I can say that culturally speaking, since I've been in different departments, it's been interesting. Freshman week, there was an event where like the Divine Nine had an event and the crowd was pepper sprayed. That was my first experience at the University of Maryland because I was in the crowd. And that really set kind of the tone of like, from the student perspective of, oh, wow, we're all here. There's so many of us. I had come from a predominantly small Catholic school, so I was very excited. But that was my first experience as a student at the school. And then I had the privilege of being in the government and politics department. So I did have Black professors available to me. So when I came to the School of Public Policy, and then I realized you taught, but like didn't teach graduate students, I was so upset because all I had was Dr. Foreman at the time. And just for our audience, I also came in the year of fall 18 when you had changed the entire curriculum of the School of Public Policy. I was in the quote guinea pig class for the new curriculum. So I kind of wanted to highlight sort of like the arc in terms of curriculum changes because of that, but also going back to Dr. Hackshaw coming in the fall of 19, where we kind of have, the training wheels have come off, so to speak, in terms of curriculum changes that happened as a result of your leadership coming in 1 year later.
I was going to also say that I think a defining moment. So, like, there was a lot of stuff that was happening, right, in 2019, where the chief diversity officer was trying to build programming, was trying to start conversations that we had not been having, introducing this at faculty meetings, trying to figure out how this was hitting students. We were talking a lot about curriculum and what needed to continue to come into the undergraduate and graduate programs. And then 2020, June 2020, right, which is when George Floyd was murdered, I just feel like there was a huge shift in terms of the openness of the school. And that's not to say that the school was not, but I feel like something happened there where people felt mobilized, that we really need to do more. We need to keep talking about this. And that's where Dean Harris is back. That's where I feel like things really started to move more quickly. So Dean Harris, I was just saying that really quickly after I had talked about my experience when I got here in the fall, that in 2020, June 2020, during the pandemic, when George Floyd was killed, that started a shift that I think really allowed things to move forward more quickly.
Obviously, I was a student in the School of Public Policy, but I TA'd for the public leadership program in College Park Scholars. And I would say that anytime a student turned in a paper where I was in the class where they were pitching proposals to implement programming, anytime a student or group of students turned in a paper and made references like, oh, what poor people need is discipline. Or like if only they just had this, they would be great. And I would be like, well, who's they? Student? And they would be like, oh, like, and I'm like, no, I don't. Please explicate for me further. So I feel like sometimes students don't realize they need, especially the undergraduate students, don't realize just how deep the biases are. They may want to do meaningful work. They may want to help the community, especially in Prince George's County, but then they don't realize how their language and their approach to a problem is missing significant pieces, significant information that would better inform and help them to actually connect better with their audience. And even in the graduate level, when we would have our pitch competition, I don't know if we still do that, but when I was a student, I remember getting feedback. I'm from Baltimore, so I'm very much of an understanding of my people and how we work and how inner cities work. And I remember getting feedback on my pitch that was like, why would anyone in Baltimore do this? Just questioning why this method of proposal, this integration of getting different departments to work together in a very easy way, why anyone in Baltimore would do that. And it was just the recognition of like, that's how we operate in Baltimore. Like little people across departments have to make those connections to serve more Black people in my community. So there were even disconnects in the pitching in that people's biases were coming out and how they graded the realism of the pitch. So highlighting that real quick, but I also kind of wanted to ask one question that I know comes up often when we see minorities and women come into high leadership positions, is the question of how can you do the work, progress the work without becoming part of the institution, part of the problem of the institution that often ends up oppressing both faculty and students in terms of progressing forward.
It is not just a professional thing. It's that in a society like this that has, I always tell my students that we are going to always look at other forms of difference, and you must understand how those intersect to shape all of us, right? But I often start with race as a primary modality because it was so integral to how this country built itself. And if you can't start there, I think a lot of times it's harder to understand how these other pieces, how these other intersections of identity matter. But I think also for our students, helping them to be conscious, helping them to be conversant about experiences that are outside of their own, are about getting great jobs, are about being great leaders, but it's also about you. What kind of person do you want to be when you leave the university and you navigate the world, right? You want to be a person that can demonstrate that you have exposure, respect, and appreciation for the experiences that other people had, even if that's not your own experience. And how do you reflect? And how do you live a life of empathy if you think that everything that you're learning and everything that you do is quote unquote objective? So I think one of the most powerful things, and I think that we sort of did some of this, I don't know how, I think there has been recently the decision at the university level to have a gen ed requirement that focuses on diversity. I think there were variations of that before, but SPP started doing that before. And I think that that's important, right? That's a space in which I think we led. That's an excellent example of that. But I think for me, when I think about this work, what makes me passionate is like, I hope these young people really understand that how they move through the world after they leave an experience like this really is going to shape the world that they live in. And 5,000 different ways I'm going to tell them it, but I really want them to walk away understanding that, and also understanding that in a school of public policy, it is one of the spaces where you have the opportunity to wrestle with people who are different than you about these issues and these ideas, because a lot of times when you leave spaces like this and you move on to your careers, your spaces look very different. They sort of resegregate because we are still in a very segregated society. University campuses, I think, continue to want to be one of the spaces where, and workplaces too, but one of the spaces where students can be pushed in their classes to think through these issues. In some ways, right, you're going to be bound by the norms of an institution, not just the norms, because you can work in many ways to change those, but they're also like, one of the restrictions is that there are rules and regulations around how things operate. And we acknowledge that when you come into a position, that's something that you have to work with. But that doesn't mean that there are not ways that you can't push for change. So you sometimes, you sometimes have to be creative, you sometimes have to be subversive, but I don't always think that when you come into an institution that I would say can foster inequities, can foster experiences of otherness. Because I think Dean Harris's trajectory at SPP is an example of it takes time, but there are ways in which you can make change. And because some of that was happening when I got here, I think it helped grease the wheels for what came next. And so I'm not saying we don't experience resistance and we're also not bound, right? Because we're a school, but then we also are part of the university. So a lot of that still continues to structure our decision making and what we're able to do. But at the same time, there are ways in which I think we're creatively making changes that allow us to move forward with the work. And I think there are other pressures that are happening across the university, outside the university, that are enabling us to move this work forward as well. So that's just to say, it's sort of this process where, yes, you're constantly thinking about, okay, did this decision I made reproduce this? And it's possible, but there are other decisions that we're making that are also, we're trying to erode at some of the patterns that create experiences of otherness, that encourage students, faculty, staff, even us to feel othered. So it's this, I think it's this back and forth. But it's not that they cancel each other out. It's a back and forth where I feel like there's this steady pace that we're moving in a, I'm not trying to paint the world beautiful rainbows, but we're getting somewhere. We're getting somewhere. So that's how I've been thinking about it.
I did want to give an opportunity to say what you feel the biggest accomplishments that have happened under your leadership, or something that you're most proud of, whether in the administrative aspect or the classroom aspect.
I feel like in part I am, I am benefiting from the work that other people have done. I'm not gonna, I think that has to be acknowledged. I would say that I feel that one of the things that I have contributed is to increasing our faculty of color. As Dean Harris noted before, for a very long time, there was one tenure track faculty member at the university in the School of Public Policy, which is, tenure is, people have their opinions about it, but it is not very easy for Black people to get. And in a field like public policy, because of the range of issues that we focus on, I think when I came and I didn't know all the faculty, I was quite frankly surprised. Because I think when I came in, and you can correct me, Nina, but at that time I was the only full-time Black female faculty member. So it was me, one other Black male who was a professional track faculty member, and Professor Foreman. And so understanding the experiences that Black people go through to get on the tenure track and to succeed at the tenure track, I really wanted to see the school be more proactive. And so in the last year or so, we have a faculty diversity committee that's been working on trying to bring in more tenure track faculty. And this year we successfully, we had a search, and we had a range of candidates come and do a speaker series, and we ended up getting a tenure track faculty member. We actually have 2 tenure track faculty members, a Black male, Black female, joining us in the fall, and that's incredible, right? If you take those 2 people and you go back 4 years and you go back another 4 years, that's still like an exception. But I think the other thing that I'm proud of is trying to push the conversation of getting people to think about, there are these narratives about why we don't show up in institutions and in spaces. And it's that they can't find enough of us. So there's not enough qualified people. And it's really not that. It's a reflection of the networks that people choose to place themselves in. It's a result of the choices of networks that people choose to keep themselves outside of. And I think in going through this process specifically, seeking excellent tenure track Black faculty members at different institutions across the US, we learned that that's what we need to be thinking about differently. It's not about qualifications, it's about where are we situating ourselves in spaces that allow us access to these people that are excellent scholars. And we recognize that that's not what we have been doing. And that's where the work needs to happen if we want to continue to expand the number of faculty of color at the school. And then also, now that we got them, what kind of environment and culture are we going to continue to develop and promote that allows them to feel like they can thrive, not just survive, but thrive and excel? So that's the next thing that I'm very excited to be working on. So there are other things, but this one piece in particular, I feel I'm really proud of. But in the Policy 302 class that Dean Harris worked really hard to make both required at the undergraduate and graduate level, I think that we are really thinking more intentionally about the content and what students really need to get out of it. Because it's one thing to say, yes, we have this required class, but what is actually going into the class that is preparing them, that is strengthening their conversance and understanding social identity's impact on a range of people's experiences, and how are they taking that out into the world? I think the way that many of us are talking about structuring the class, I think we're also going to make, not that we haven't already, but we're going to continue to make, I think, significant inroads that will shape what our future leaders will be doing and how they'll be thinking once they leave the halls of SPP. So Dean Harris, I was just talking about the Policy 302 class, and I think how one thing that we should be proud of is how we're continuing to think about how this class should evolve for students. So I was just filling in space until you came in.
Do you think that, since we're talking about students, do you believe that students over the years have helped set the stage to help advocate for some of these changes that you've gotten in the past and some of the ones that you're fighting for in the future? Do you feel that the current crop of graduate and undergraduate students are a force to be reckoned with in terms of like helping you more easily argue for some of the changes that youth are seeking to make because they're backing you up, so to speak?
I mean, the thing that also happens is when you make significant changes and students come in and they're benefiting from it too, they're sort of like, well, life is good. So what additional incentives do I have to keep fighting? So that sometimes makes it hard. Like sometimes we're doing things so well that some of the students may not feel like they need to consistently work collectively to hold us accountable and to make the world, to make the work more sustainable. But there definitely have been students that have worked themselves to the bone, graduate students and undergraduate students. But we also have to remember, just like Dean Harris said, if we don't have a collective, if we don't have a significant mass of students, when it falls on 3 or 4 people, it is really hard to sustain the work. And the other piece is that students are here for 4 years. Some graduate students are here for 2 years. PhD students, there are far fewer Black PhD students, but we have them. They're here a little bit longer, but that's the other thing that, that we're also keeping in mind, like that's the challenge that comes with keeping the work sustainable. But I do think I think that many of them have held us accountable, have continued to push us, have continued to encourage us to think about issues and concerns that we sometimes may miss as a faculty member and administrator, and that they're crucial to this work continuing. We absolutely need student voices. And I think moving forward, we want to be more intentional about when students come into the major, them seeing that's part of what we want their experience to be at SPP. Black students, our Asian students, and so this is where when we talk about DEIB, I think thinking about for a school like this, should the collective be bigger, and might that in the long run it'll benefit all students, but in particular Black students, right? How might that collective need to look to really for our students to benefit, particularly our Black students? So I think that that's something that definitely as the Chief Diversity Officer, I'm constantly thinking about, right? Because it's sort of like a moving target. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Before I let you go, what do you envision are 2 to 3 things that you're like, I'm working on this, and if this could happen in the next 2 to 5 years, I will be a happy camper?
I want to say that when I think about the school, I definitely want to see the school making inroads around research and training students on the significance of race and racism in public policy. I think they're getting more of that in the classes, but I also want to see that translated into students doing more research, us bringing in more graduate students that want to focus on that. But I think trying to develop our chops research wise around that would be, I think, a wonderful long term goal. Um, I also want to see, I also look forward to seeing more of our faculty who I think have expressed a lot of interest in growing in this space, continue to grow in their training and their facility and incorporating this into their classes, and that across the school that we have a shared understanding of what diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging look like. And for me, ultimately, it's about seeing these ideas and beliefs and values of all the members of our community are integrated into how the culture of the school functions. It's not that we're just here, because you always can have representation, right? But it's how that representation is being incorporated and supported and valued. And so we are on our way. We're not all the way there, but I do believe in the next few years we're going to be further along because we're building those pieces. We got the building blocks and they're getting stronger. Um, and so I'm looking forward to seeing that. And the other piece is I think also our leadership team is also strengthening their capacity and their conversance. And I mean, we got ways to go, but I think also us being in a space where we can signal the significance of the cross connections between faculty, staff, and students. So we're all in synergy. It's not that the knowledge and the understanding is only with this part of the school, that it really is showing up in all these spaces. And so, that's my goal for the next, couple of years, that we really harness that energy and we have this stronger shared understanding of our expectations of each other as a community with respect to DEIB, that it's not sort of like Dean Harris said, it's something you can opt into. No, it is like something that centers the culture of the school and what we produce. So.
Absolutely. I want to thank you tremendously for coming on this podcast, talking to myself, and then sharing all of your knowledge and experience for whoever is going to be watching.
Thanks for the opportunity.